Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 751st New Social Environment. I'm Chloe, Director of Programs here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Hans Haacke and Yasi Alipour. We're thrilled to welcome poet Orchid Tierney here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we're on Lenape Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, but serve as a reminder place of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land that we're speaking from. And now it's my absolute pleasure to introduce today's guest and host. For 6 decades, Hans Haacke has been a pioneer in kinetic art, environmental art, conceptual art, and institutional critique. He's had solo exhibitions internationally, including at the New Museum and the Museo Nacional Centro de Arte, Reina, Sofía. He has participated in many international exhibitions, including Documenta, the Lyon Biennial, the Liverpool Biennial, and others. He won the prestigious Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale in 1993. Haacke has lived and worked in New York since 1965. Iranian artist, writer, and folder Yasi Alipour currently lives in Brooklyn and wonders about paper, counting, and silence. She received her MFA from Columbia University and is a faculty member at Columbia, Parsons, and SVA New York. And with that, it's my absolute pleasure to pass it over to Yasi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Chloe, you mentioned the number 700. Now it's been more than 700. I felt shocked when I think about it being 500s, and the rail keeps doing these on a daily basis. I've always been humbled to be a part of it, and especially today, being in conversation with the incredible artist, teacher, social being, and truly inspiring person, Hans Haacke. Hans, to start, I wanted to kind of pause. Yesterday, the Brooklyn Rail screened your documentary, Hans Haacke, 40 Years. And I had the opportunity to see it with a classroom of students. And for me, there was a moment seeing a new generation of artists feeling inspired, motivated, moved by your work. And it was almost like a homecoming, because I remember when I saw your work for the first time and learning more about it and feeling that sense of possibility. I also remember the moment when I realized that a lot of my teachers have had that experience with your work too. So thank you for being here. Thank you for accepting our invitation, and so excited about this interview. Hi, yep. Hans.
Hi.
So I have some questions for us, and I really look forward to see where the conversation takes us. Hans, to get us started, so for everyone, there's an incredible exhibition of Hans's work, mostly focusing on work from 1975 to 1985 at Paula Cooper currently, and I must say, it felt very special to have that space and spend time with the work. So I hope everyone gets a chance to see it. And this is an image of kind of a public-facing installation that is part of that exhibition. But Hans, to get us started, I wanted to actually talk about a book that was recently published of your work. It's Hans Haacke, Swiss Institute's Visitors Polls. I wanted to ask you about the visitor polls, how they got started and how they have continued over the years. To me, they have always felt very core to your work.
Well, that goes back to 1969, I believe. My first poll of sorts was at the Howard Wise Gallery on 57th Street. I had a solo show there, and I wanted to know, and also wanted the visitors to know about themselves, where they are coming from, that is to say, where they were born and where they are living now. And I had large maps of New York, of the United States and the world. And with pins, red and blue pins, I wanted them to mark where they were born and where they are living now. And of course, at the time, many of the visitors who participated in this poll with pins were living downtown of New York, and then the more wealthy uptown, and there were also many who who pointed out where they actually came from originally. And that was interesting for me, but possibly and hopefully also interesting for them to recognize to what demographic environment they belong. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking something that has remained really moving, like from that very early piece and the way you use technology then to today, is that sense of recognizing who the public is in the environment where we're seeing the work kind of at the same time as the information is being gathered. Or what you said about kind of the demographic. It was interesting seeing the polls in your retrospective at the new museum, because now with the current technologies, we could see the results. So there were questions that were about the demographic, there were questions that were related to political, kind of urgent political questions of the time, and we could see the result. With the Swiss Institute, the same thing was happening and then the data was being analyzed in different ways, like comparing what different demographics were there, what languages were spoken. For me, it kind of brings up the different parts of your interest in sculpture, work influenced by environments, and the socio-political, like all together. It's not much of a question.
Well, over the years, since 69, I did a great number of such interactions with the visitors of either my own exhibitions or group exhibitions. And as the technology evolved, and as you mentioned, the new museum and also the Swiss Institute, now they answer specific questions, 10 demographic, 10 opinion questions on a laptop or some other device, and with a little delay so that they do not lose their anonymity. Their answers appear in the accumulation on a screen, so that immediately, or rather they recognize how they fit into the demographic demographics of the visitors who participated in the poll, and how the opinions differ from one to the other?
Yeah, it's so interesting, Hans, because experiencing them in that way like really activates the space for us as viewers, because as you said, you kind of understand what your relationship is with the demographics. For example, when I did the one at the new museum, I was aware that like where I was from was different, but my interest in an art professional, like as someone who's involved in the art world, was similar to the majority. I wanted to mention this with the Swiss Institute's book. For me, what was really interesting was a question that felt very different, which is when you offered your viewers the chance to have a question. I'm trying to like find the language you used. You said, what multiple choice question would you like to see in this poll? And then you had provided a single page where they got a chance to write it. And it was really interesting. And the book publishes a lot of these gatherings of what people submitted. And of course, it's not a data that can be easily processed, but the results were really interesting. Some were like funny doodles, some were really deep political questions. I started noticing the languages that the audience used much more. I also noticed you mentioned that it was a suggestion or inspired by a suggestion by your wife, Linda. And I couldn't help but notice her name comes up quite often in your letter, in your writings, in some of the most important parts of your work and your questions, like from 1968 to this day. So yeah, I would love to learn more about that question and the importance of her partnership.
Well, she has been a partner of life and in many other ways. And as you already said, she suggested I ask the visitors not only to respond to questions I pose, but that they should in turn also offer questions. And some did, in fact, on the piece of paper that was offered, ask multiple choice questions. Others made comments or drew pictures. It was a very, very, very diverse kind of response.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book. And now the data that you gather from the rest of the poll can be processed in so many ways. So it gives us a snapshot of how we understand that institution and its relationship to the public. But I found that last question to be really moving. Chloe, can we go to the next slide? Hans, I'm gonna shift gears a bit. I want us to turn our focus to the exhibition, the current exhibition at Paula Cooper, taking stock 1975 to 1985. It has felt important. The exhibition focuses on this very significant decade in your work, and the pieces that are shown ask a lot of questions that seem very urgent and persistent in our time too. So there are pieces that think about the influence of capital on what we understand art to be, how industries and big corporations deal with art. But where I wanted to start, the exhibition gave me a reason to return and really focus on that decade and how your work from that decade asks questions that we still have to face and think about. I start with this piece, which is one of your most known and iconic works. This is a painting by Seurat, and as people know, it follows the histories of its ownership and how it's shifted. But I wanted to actually use this as a chance to discuss another piece that kind of uses a similar format, and that's your response to Monet's A Bunch of Asparagus for Project 74, or your proposal for Project 74. Can you tell us about that piece a bit?
Okay. The museum in Cologne, at the time it was called the Wallraf Richards Museum, invited me to participate in a group show. And I decided to focus on one of the works that they had acquired, and through a donation, a very recent donation by a person that played a certain role, namely the head of the Deutsche Bank, which was, or maybe still is today, the biggest bank in Germany. The reason why that intrigued me was because he also played a role during the Third Reich, during the Nazi period. And that to put this together with the history of the ownership of the Bunch of Asparagus by Manet mattered a great deal, because a number of the previous owners were Jewish. For one, it's interesting how a painting changes ownership and so forth, who they are, and so on. I give the as far as I could find out a biography of the people, but the trigger, as I started off saying, was that it passed through a very, from my point of view, controversial, and namely somebody who had a Nazi history and then became a banker and collected money of his banking associates and others to buy the money and donate, as one says, to the museum. And I made the work, and the museum didn't want to show it. In effect, they censored it. And Daniel Buren, who was also invited to the same exhibition, asked me to provide him with copies of all the panels of the ownerships of the work, which I gave him, and he pasted those over his parallel stripes that he wanted to, that he was invited to present in the show. And in the night before the opening, museum people came and pasted a white piece of paper over the provenance of the Manet, and in effect also censored what Daniel Buren had done.
Hans, for me, it was so moving to read kind of how about that project, and especially in working conditions. You write about it with clarity of the way your work was censored, that you kind of make a document that like carries who voted against it. But the part I found really interesting is that you mentioned that in response to the censorship of your work, there were artists like Soloid who pulled their work before the exhibition. And there were artists like, there was Daniel Buren that repeated your work and got recensored. And then after his work, more artists pulled their work from the show. For me, it was really interesting to also be reminded. You mentioned in one of your writings that the museum kind of had this slogan they wanted to promote, saying art remains art. And in Daniel Buren's response, he changed that to art remains politics. And then in another case of the censorship of your work, and that was in response to the Guggenheim censoring your work, I found this photo of artists from Art Workers Coalition protesting that censorship, and even a photograph of Yvonne Reiner in that protest. I would love to hear more first about that distance from art remains art to art remains political, but also how your artist community or you being part of this artist community activated the work too.
Well, let me first speak about art remains art. There never has been art by itself. It has always been done in a social environment. It was part of that, and that social environment affected how it was presented, but also how it was made by the artist, for that matter. Artists are not different from everybody else. And that this is true for anybody, also priests. They are also part of society, and there is nothing separate, and one should always think of a society in a sociological terms.
You just put it so beautifully, and I think it has felt so important how you have maintained such a clarity with that. They don't make it opaque. Hans, I would, Chloe, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So this is a detail, and then can we go to the next slide? Hans, I wanted to ask you, I just want to know, perhaps on a nearly selfish level, can you tell us about Art Workers Coalition and artists like David Buren, Soloid, Yvonne Reiner, or how that conversation with other artists influenced your work?
Well, at the end of the 60s, if I remember correctly, and I always have to preface what I'm saying in this way because my memory is not precise and good anymore. It was the uprising in Paris that inspired also people here in New York. And in effect, it was the Greek artist Takis, who lived in Paris and exhibited here in New York in the same gallery with which I was associated, the Howard Wise Gallery, to introduce us to the how shall I call it? Well, to make us aware of the social political environment in which we happened to be there at the time, and that became in effect the source of what then was called itself the Art Workers Coalition. And next to the Art Workers Coalition, there was also another group of artists that took on social issues, and I can't think of the name at the moment, but it was as important. And there were a great number of people that we know today, and some of them were well known at the time already. To challenge museums in New York about how they go about things. And the Museum of Modern Art was one of the museums that where demonstrations inside and outside took place many times. And it had well, it rallied more people, and also for the 1970s, it made artists and the art world in general aware that art is part of the general social environment, and that museums, and particularly those who are behind the museums, the board of trustees, that they potentially are involved in things that one does not agree with. And therefore, one has to raise hell, so to speak.
And you know, Hans, for me, it feels so important hearing that from you, because sometimes being reminded of the issues today, it might be hard. It might be easy to forget that artists did raise hell, and artists can continue to do that. As I mentioned to you earlier, I think I learned a great deal in the last fall as someone who took part in the new school part-time faculty strikes. But Hans, there was this moment where me and my friends were trying to figure out how to create signs that shares the information that people need to know as we're picketing in the middle of this moment. I think we also learned a lot because we were a lot of artists that were suddenly meeting each other as art educators on the street. And I must say that experience really made me understand your work on a different level, and the way you work with information, visuals, different publics, and sharing those stories. It's my long way of desiring to ask you about your protests also alongside art teachers, especially at Cooper Union.
Well, I was very fortunate that in the late 1960s, I was hired by Cooper Union as an adjunct to teach in the arts school, the foundation program, and also sculpture classes. And sculpture classes, I should put in quotation marks, because the way I went about it was not that the exclusively making objects, but also doing other things. That was very important for me. Also, when I got into trouble with the Guggenheim Museum, that was a backing that I continue to have. And I must say Cooper Union was really backing me at the time. It was very important.
Mhm.
But also at Cooper Union, when the faculty started to unionize, all hell broke out. And there were demonstrations outside of the school. That is to say, the teachers who wanted to unionize did demonstrations, and also prominent artists from the city participated in it. And eventually, the procedures that are required to get a group of workers to be accepted as a union, it went through court proceedings, and I and others had to testify in a court downtown. But in effect, whatever the agency is that made the final decision that yes, there should be a union, agreed with the faculty at Cooper Union, and therefore, since then, it was, I don't remember exactly when in the 70s this happened, there is a unionized faculty.
I'm just pausing on that because I deeply believe that that's important. Yeah, I feel grateful to also be part of a union and for those who made it possible. Hans, a lot of times we kind of talked about the censorship of your work, but also your refusal to self-censor, and also the different ways other artists spoke up, so kind of refused to silence that. So I think in your work, I think a lot about the board of trustees, the directors, all the people who didn't want your work to be shown. But you also often talk about the curators, the directors, those who made your work be shown. I asked you earlier today, and it was fascinating because I was wondering about how you found all the informations you need for your work. And you mentioned reading the news a lot, but also the public library, which I think for my generation, it can be hard to remember. But yeah, I would love to, sometimes with the Guggenheim, you talk about it, sometimes with your exhibition in France, in Paris, you talk about it. But how did you find the people that helped make your work be shown, be made? Yeah, how did they influence your work? I know it's a very vague question.
Yeah, well, it varies from place to place, and to personal connections, and to who the people are that one has to deal with. I cannot give a general answer to that question, but I must say I have been lucky, as I often say, I have been lucky to meet and connect with people who supported me, but whom I could trust. And some of them not necessarily because they helped me, but because the attitudes with which they functioned were affected negatively in their career. And situation at the Guggenheim Museum, where my exhibition was censored, the curator in charge of that exhibition stood up for me, and he was fired.
Right. Yeah. I have always been really moved by how you have always continued telling that story, so we don't forget.
Well, I should interject that the many of the people who work in museums, of course, depend on not only the director of the museum, but also the board of trustees for their to stay and to advance in the hierarchy of the museum. It is sometimes a very risky operation, and therefore, even though personally they may be on the side of the artist, they cannot really do what or do not dare doing what they do. And one of the makes me think of John Hightower at the Museum of Modern Art, who tolerated or who accepted when I did a poll there about Rockefeller and his connection to Nixon. He was challenged by the then vice president, I believe, of the board to take that out, and he didn't. And this and possibly other things that he did caused him to be fired after 2 years. And that is the risk that people in these positions take if they do not do exactly what the board is expecting from them.
Chloe, can we go up to the next slide? I'm trying to. Yeah, this was and for anyone who gets to see the show, for me was really amazing. So this is one of your very well-known pieces that kind of one of your pieces that focuses on mobile and its influences on politics and art. Can we go to the next slide? It was really exciting to find this piece that is that is based on a letter from a lawyer at Mobile that is writing in this terrifying passive-aggressive language, objecting to your work and referencing this interview you did with your Tate exhibition. So you included all of that in that piece. So if anyone gets to see the show, this work has not been shown since the 80s, so it feels really special to be able to read it in details. Can we go to the next slide, Chloe? Thank you. So Hans, in thinking about this exhibition, and for me, it's so interesting hearing you today, because everything you say are things that I feel like we have to remind ourselves and our role as artists. I went back to this book that, for me, is one of the most important books around contemporary art, which is a conversation between you and Pierre Bourdieu, called Free Exchange. It's a long format interview, kind of beginning with your conversations in the 90s, a recording in 90, I think 91, I should have it, and then edited until 93. But Hans, returning to that book and the two of you kind of having a deep conversation around the same time as a lot of the pieces in this show, and also at an era that now we might remember as the not only the end of the Cold War or the later part of the Cold War, but also kind of the cultural war, especially here and also in Paris. But the two of you kind of talk in depth about how you understand the role of the artist and the role of the intellectual. You kind of talk a lot about the importance of not giving up or not kind of hiding in institutions or under kind of desires for sentences like art remains art. I bring that piece up, I bring that conversation up because I would love to learn more about that dialogue with Pierre Bourdieu. I also wanted to say that what I find most inspiring about it, that you two are so deeply critical, and yet in the whole interview, you're never cynical. Like, you really have faith in the work that has to be done. Can you tell us about how we think about the role of the artist or the intellectual, but also the conversation with Pierre Bourdieu?
Well, I had read a number of things that Pierre Bourdieu had written and published, and I don't remember how it happened that I actually connected with him in Paris, and we had this conversation, and that was then published. I was very intrigued by him because he, in effect, spoke about the interconnection between everything in society. And that is something that is, in effect, also something that is that makes me work the way I do, namely to understand that art is not happening in a cathedral. It is a part of the general setting of everything, and responds to it and is affected by, has a potential effect on it. So it was incredible that I did not expect in any way that I would be talking to one of the major French intellectuals at the time. And I did, and we had a great conversation.
And sometimes, Hans, when I've mentioned that book, and I say an interview, I forget that people might not imagine that it's like 100-page book of like in-depth questions. But Hans, he also deeply believed in your work. Like it's so interesting to see how much the two of you respect each other's work. I was also thinking, because I feel like the two of you talk about the NEA, the censorships that were happening at the time, the politicians that were really blatantly pushing against works of art and artists' freedom. So I can't help but think about the parallels to our time. And I think that's something that comes up a lot with the current show. But yeah, I was really moved to think the way you think about the cultural industry. Or I was just thinking the other day, I was like, now we remember that decade as like the culture wars, but that relationship of culture, power, art, I think for both of you, that's not something that was a matter of a decade. It's part of the work of being an artist or being an intellectual.
Yeah, no, we apparently sort of inspired each other. It was great.
Yeah. So Hans, I have one of my questions that is not kind of not a question, but you mentioned this before. You taught for a really long time at Cooper Union, and you were closely involved with the Whitney ISB program. I would love to understand more what teaching had meant to you and how it influenced your work.
Well, as I may have mentioned, I got a degree as an art teacher when I graduated in Germany. And I really enjoy interacting with students, young ones or older ones, doesn't matter. It changes, of course, to some degree as far as the age is concerned. But I always very much enjoyed freshmen.
Mm.
And then to interact with people who were on the way to find out what they would like to do on their own. And I never told them what they should do. I tried to get them to find their own their own methods, their own goals, their own ideas, encourage them. And what was very important teaching at Cooper Union in that respect was that I did not tell them when we met every week what I think and what they should do. I encouraged them to discuss among each other their own work, and then also inject occasionally some questions and opinions, but I didn't want to run the show, so to speak, and impose my point of view right from the beginning.
Mm. I'm writing that down as an art teacher. I feel like there's a lot there. Hans, my last question is not much of a question. It's more of a thank you. something I've always that I was really moved by is that the book that was published alongside your retrospective at the new museum, Hans Haacke, All Connected. There, a lot of the essays in that catalog are from a younger generation of artists. So there's Park MacArthur, Sharon Hayes, Andrea Frazier, Sam Durant, Wally Broad, Tania Bruguera, like so many more. And for me, it was so moving to see the echoes of work for another generation. Rod from the book that I just want to read. I thought it was such a beautiful way of understanding your work and its influence in how we understand contemporary art. So I'm reading the quote. Throughout the past decade, Hans has not confused what and how he taught as a professor at Cooper Union with what and how he created as an artist, nor with what and how he created as an artist, nor with how he moved through the world as a social person. Yes, some of these spaces overlap, but his sensitivity to what each space permits and limits by way of material and immaterial effects remains inviolable. Hans, it's so interesting because the space where we meet each other today is called a new social environment. And I can't help but think about how important your work has been in our understanding of what a social environment means. So yeah, any thoughts about these intergenerational conversations, but more than that, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we can open to questions from the audience. I don't want to take too much space. I think it's such a gift to have Hans here. So yeah, Chloe, I'll pass it to you. I'm sure you know more.
Yasi and Hans, that was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to both of you. And thank you, Hans, for your generosity in sharing all of this amazing context and all the stories behind your work. We do have a few questions from the audience. And so the first one is going to be from John. John, I will allow you to unmute now. Let me... There you go.
Hi, Hans. Hi, Yasi. Thank you very much, both of you, for the interview and the questions. I had a question related to your relationships with curators who become kind of double agents for you within institutions. I was wondering if, as much as you remember, you might be willing to reflect on your relationship with Okwi and Wazor. Perhaps you could tell us how that began. I note that your work for the second Johannesburg Biennial was not actually in the catalog. So I wonder if that was a late addition, or if you have any reflections about subsequent projects at Venice or the work at Haus der Kunst. It would be great to hear any of those things.
Well, Okwi and Wazor was, and unfortunately, he is not with us anymore. A very, very unusual curator, and for that matter, also director of institutions. I don't know whom I could compare him with. He did a number of exhibitions in which I participated. First one at the Johannesburg Biennial that I believe you just mentioned. He was a very young man at the time. He was so young that I couldn't believe that he was in charge of it when he addressed all the artists who had come to participated in the event. And I believe when he died, he was not even 60 years old. It's very sad. He was an extraordinary man, and all the things that he did, documenta, and I was not involved in everything, of course, but he, as a director or the person in charge, did things that not too many people dared doing at the time.
Thank you so much, John, for that question. And thank you, Hans, for that answer. Our next question from the audience is going to be from GE. GE, I'll give you the chance to unmute.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Yasi, and thank you so much, Hans, for sparing some time with us. My question is, early on, did you set any rules that helped you prepare for sort of the long haul of sustaining your work over these decades?
I'm not quite sure what you mean.
Well, did you have a plan in the beginning to know that you had a great epic ahead of you, and that you wanted to put things in place to make that epic happen over this immense amount of time?
Well, I could say I'm stubborn. And so what I am doing at a certain time, and I believe in it, well, I do it no matter what, and therefore I got into a lot of trouble here and there. And in retrospect, that is now venerated, but not at the time. Yeah, it's just that you do what you believe in.
That would be it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that question, GE, and thank you for that answer, Hans. The next question is going to be from me. Hans, I'm wondering, many of the works, if not all, on view at Paula Cooper are from the collection of Gilbert and Lila Silverman. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about your relationship with the Silvermans, and the importance of that relationship to your career.
Well, it is Gil Silverman, backed by his wife, Lila, was a very extraordinary person. In the 70s, he hung out in New York and connected with the Fluxus people. And somehow, and I don't know exactly how that came about, he also got interested in what I was doing and what I was exhibiting at the John Webber Gallery at the time in Seoul, when Seoul was full of galleries, and also startups, and it was not fancy galleries. And very early in the 70s, he had money. I believe he was involved in real estate. I'm not quite sure. He was from near Detroit. He bought works of mine and continued throughout his life. And he's the only collector I ever had who bought continuously works of mine and works that were not in any way promising in terms of market value. And I connected with him personally. I was in Detroit a couple of times, not because I wanted to meet him, but I was at the museum. I was invited to give a talk and so forth, and I connected with him there. And I saw he invited me to come home. And in effect, at his home, when I was there, I saw Margaret Thatcher on his living room wall, which was quite remarkable. I remember that well. And we kept in personal contact with each other over the years. And unfortunately, he died then, and also just shortly before, no, I'm not quite sure. I believe his wife Lila, who survived him, then died shortly after my show at the New Museum. They were great people. I was connected with both of them personally. I saw them frequently, and they acquired works that, as I said, were not bought in order to make money. They bought what they believed in, and I wish that there are many other artists who meet people like them.
Thank you so much for that answer, Hans. The last question today is going to be from the Rails publisher and artistic director, Phong H. Bui. Phong, you should be able to unmute now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chloe. Thank you, Hans.
Hi, Phong.
Good to see you. I love the show. It stirred up so many memories, especially, you know, when we were both speakers at our beloved friend Lyon Biennial Memorial at the Great Hall. I think it must have been in April 2005. I mean, there were other people, Hans Ulrich Abris and John Burr for sure, Rob Stewart, I remember Kiki Smith and Clayton Asherman, the poet, among others. And it just occurred to me that how much we miss him.
Yes.
And so I've been thinking a great deal, Hans, how, for example, it must have been in 1940 when Heinrich Himmler came to Hitler and say, Führer, we must make, you know, as many, 2 million plus cheap radio and give it away to every single household in Germany so they can carry your message directly and fast. So I was thinking about how, you know, someone who like yourself as an artist contemplate on the most thoughtful slowness of thinking as counter to speed, which is what dictators are good at in using technology through speed. And so I just want to ask the fact that we have to deal with technology, Hans, and I can't think anybody who deploy it as effectively as you have. I'm learning to do it now, of course, with the rail through the Zoom as we are now talking on this very platform. How do you think about Silicon Valley people, you know, who essentially have no historical memory, Hans? I have other questions, but that's the first one.
Well, that's not so easy to answer. I can only speculate.
Mm.
I would I imagine
Yeah.
that they are fascinated by the technology and the development of all the things that we're dealing with today.
Mm.
I don't know to what extent they think about the effects that it have, and I'm not saying that they should stop doing what they're doing, but the applications are and I'm not using the word application now in the terms of the technology, but
Yeah.
who is using it for what? That is, of course, an issue, and I don't know to what extent they are involved in that, and want to make sure that it is done in a way that they believe it should be done. And then, of course, we talk about what should society be like and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm thinking about what to write on my March editorial, I just realized the kind of virtue as a patient of Chinese people, because, when you grown up like Vietnam, you just have to be aware of China, like the way if you're born in Poland, you
Yeah.
probably have the same feeling about Germany and Russia. But the virtue of Chinese people is the massive scale of production. And I think that whatever the free access, which America had brought technology and entrepreneurship to China for cheaper labor costs throughout the 90s, certainly right after the Cold War ended in 91 and 92, China was welcomed to World Trade Organization. So whatever the virtue of being patient, being sitting, I've been flat on its back since the Opium War, if you can go that far, is no longer the case, because the subverting the consuming culture, the addiction of the product has been made in China for feeding the middle class American in the suburb, has now become so apparent. So my question is your view on how the emergence of communist China and communism in the world in general, the fact that the collapse of Soviet Union, it doesn't imply that communism will go away. And I know that this is a subject that I used to love talking to Leon and Nancy. So I asked of you in the same way. I mean, you've been contemplating the West and the East for a long time too, not just inside of the US or inside European country in its cultural firmament.
Well, it is difficult or impossible to speak about so-called communism,
Yes.
because over the years, a lot of people and regimes have adopted so-called communism, and a good number of them have done terrible things under that label.
Yeah.
And therefore I try to stay away from it, even the term socialism
Yes.
has can get you into trouble, not because there's something wrong with socialism, but it has been associated with regimes that I would not like to be connected with.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't I do this? Ask a question that I've been dying to ask. There's others, but let's just end with this one. I know that you study with William Stanley Hayter. It's interesting artist recently because I had been collecting some of his print for a while.
Really?
Yeah, they modest one, you know, in the 90s when people were neglecting the works, you can certainly purchase one or two for less than 1,000. But in any way, I have a few. And just the question of one-dimensional reading, which given label or niching people in certain places, which what, you know, this culture loves in doing. I just discovered that in 1934, he had befriended with the young painter Bartos and invited him to his country home in Chelsea, in England, in the countryside, gave him the novel Wuthering Heights, which he read entirely in one few days, I think in one sitting. He was taken by the poem, by the book, and then decided only to illustrate it. The first quarter when Heathcliff and Cathy was happy in their adolescence, which was printed in the magazine Minotaur 1935. So I was very taken by this deep friendship between them. So I asked the same with you, having studied with Hayter, what was the experience like and what have you learned from him?
Well, he had a print studio in Paris.
Yes.
And with a scholarship that I got after I graduated, I spent a year in Paris and signed up to print in his studio. And of course, I met him a number of times, but I did not have close connections with him. So I cannot really speak about him extensively. But I should mention in this context that that is also where I met Leon Gollet. He
Yes.
was also printing there, and a number of other people, one or two that I'm still connected with.
So this must have been, Hans, because that printing studio was called Atelier 17, I think. And it was for the time in fact, in New York, associated with the New School between 45 and 50, and then it moved back to Paris afterwards. So that's where you have.
But Hayter, I believe, did not work in New York. It was one of his associates who did the thing here in New York.
I see. Huh. So that's where you met Leon, and how was that? How was the meeting with Leon? Because I know that he was there with Nancy for quite some time during, of course, the war against Algeria, which is very important to both of them. Were you involved in that dialogue at all, Hans?
No, I really connected with him when I came to New York.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
And also with Nancy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a long-lasting friendship. Well, congratulations, and I encourage you all who haven't seen the show, go see the show. It's very pertinent, very prescient to what we are going through right now. So congratulations, Hans, and hang it back to you, Chloe.
Thank you for
Thank you so much, Fong, and thank you for those amazing answers, Hans. At the Rail, we have a tradition of ending our community events with a poetry reading, and I'm thrilled to welcome our poet laureate of the day, Orchid Tierney, to the stage. Orchid Tierney is a poet and scholar from New Zealand. She's the author of the collection A Year of Misreading the Wildcats and 7 chapbooks, most recently Looking at the Tiny, Mad Lichen on the Surfaces of Reading. Her scholarship, reviews, and poetry have appeared or are forthcoming in many notable publications. She's the recipient of the Ohio Arts Council Individual Artist Excellence Award and is the Black Earth Institute Fellow for 2022 through 2025. She's an assistant professor of English at Kenyon College. And with that, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Orchid.
Oh my gosh, thank you, Chloe. This has been such a fantastic conversation. Thank you, Hans and Yasi, for this really lovely talk. I just love how succinctly, Hans, you described art not being in a cathedral, and just how art is this part of this social environment that shapes production and distribution. I found that the discussion about the academic museum labor, union labor, this hierarchy is really generative, and it made me sort of think about non-human labor, actually, which kind of dovetails into my fields of inquiry. I'm just going to read, just to close us out, from my new manuscript called All Our Names Are Kin, a field guide to future flora, which is essentially on future expressions of flora, plant thinking, which Michael Marder describes as being imagistic, non-cognitive, as well as decentralized and dehumanized, as well as trans-species entanglements in a post-climate change Midwest, which is where I'm based. The speculative prose poems are featuring dispersed subjectivities that are actually written through the rhizosphere network. And so the underlying questions in this collection that I'm really interested in are what formal strategies might exist for staging poetry within a messy, rooty network, as opposed to institutions or structures of socially inflected eco-poetic thought. And what does it mean to think as plants, knowing that we as human knowledge workers are pre-plants, as Maureen McLean argues. So I'm just going to read 3 poems just to close this out. They're all untitled, but they're all interconnected. It's amazing how the sun is a soft structure, a suitor, how the light returns the next day, how systems imagine the end of a world is a continuance of another, how mice digest owls is a reversal of expectations, how cells pass cold images and information to stringy roots, how breath knots and microbes tangle tiny cellular dramas, how for the bat a white noise is a mile a minute, how a princess tree is a wind spinner, a leaf is a limb, a bad metaphor, how floronauts demand labor from hummingbirds and possums, how a friendly neighbor is a kind of bee, a kind bomb, a time bomb, a realtor, a mob, how one colony is much like another, how the pollinator trades with the flower, how this meadow of pinks and greens, hues, made of wheat, a repetition, how a stem is a neck craning for a seasonal difference, how the flower head is a vagrant and an intruder, a network of dirt, how a system is a verb, a noun, and something gross in between. Plant time verbs, a measure of light, calefaction, decomposition, transmutation, volatile cues, future stings of old experiences, deep reckonings with dynamic images, hothouse compressions or manipulations of vegetal o'clock. A flavor savor commodifies time. The rightness of that fruit is an error in division. Technofossils overlaid with vegetal matter. It's amazing how the sunlight marks the next day, proper time for sowing, or sugar in the dirt, a half season of roots, the smir, and then end of harvest, a reddish underwinter to fall down out in for love. Then wintering is whiskey, a repetition, iteration, irritation, a bad metaphor. What time is a matter of inflection. 400 rings in the tree is equal to a phalange in the sand. one shiny pebble shaved into grain, a maple tree, angel oak, the building of Chichen Itza, silence between biblical testaments, and one 6-pack of plastic rings. Flowers are slow-moving cows of the glebe and gentle observers, always facing the south. The light within Kin's Basin is brisk and simple, pleasant. The motion of day to night and all between is a negligible sensation. What matters is the eating and communing of roots. Small dramas are the exchanges of nutrients and bacteria who pass knowledge like letters. Some flowers archive some forgotten plain in the stem down to the root. Hurt brings pleasure without joy. Others tingle as a browning leaf suddenly recalls a thickened past without the radiance of language. And there is a shared nod between flowers that history is absurd. The temperature of grief is proof, such matter that bacteria share like love letters. And I'll pass it back to Chloe. Thank you.
Orchid, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wow. So many of those lines are going to sit with me. Thank you so much for that. Thank you as well again to Yasi and to Hans for this incredible conversation today. Thank you to the team at Paula Cooper Gallery for helping us prepare in advance of today's event. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making daily conversations like this one possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can find on the Rail's YouTube channel. For 22 years, the Rail has provided a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like this one, our daily NSE. You can check the chat for a link to donate to support the Rail. And if you're free tomorrow at 1 p.m., join us for 3 languages, a Rail poetry reading curated by Leonard Schwartz. And as is tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you, Yasi. Thank you, Hans.
Thank you, Hans. Thank you, Orchid.
Thank you so much.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you, Orchid.
Thank you, Orchid.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Orchid.
Thank you. Thank you.
And
Have a good one, y'all.
Okay. Go
Bye.
see the show,
Thank you.
everyone.
see the show.
See Hans' show. It's up for a while.